Hi everyone, welcome to our final week before reading break or reading week. So it's great we've made it, final stretch before reading week, and moving into, I think, a really fascinating area of political philosophy. So we began this course by discussing the origins of the political, and I suggested, following Roberto Esposito, that these origins can be traced back to the Greeks' reaction to the atrocities of the Trojan War. So if you'll recall, Hannah Arendt sees this war as a way to find glory, or kleos, and excellence, arete, and asserts that the establishment of the political is a way to continue the possibility of this glory without the atrocities of war. On the other hand, Simone Weil told us that she saw the Athenian reaction to the Trojan War as a codification of the violent oppression of war into the state. So, while vastly different, both of these thinkers turn to Homer and the Iliad as a way to think through the origins of the political. However, Homer is not the only game in town when it comes to political origins. And over the next couple of weeks, we're going to turn to another text that many, including the social political figure Mahatma Gandhi, saw as the origins of the political, the Bhagavad Gita. So the Gita is a Hindu text that is part of a larger body of work called the Mahabharata. And it was around approximately 400 BCE that it was written. So to place this on the timeline, that's 4 years before the birth of Jesus Christ and approximately 100 years after Homer's Iliad is put into writing. It's attributed to Veda Vyasa, who is a character also featured in the Mahabharata. And also, you will note in the first chapter is featured there as well. Um, so there are a number of translations of the Gita, but this one remains my favorite. Um, there are certain things there's no perfect translation of it to my mind. There are some things that I feel like I kind of didn't get with this one that I would have liked you to see, but generally, I do believe that this one is my personal favorite one. And I have included, you'll notice, the description of the text as well as the poem itself that kind of makes up both of these chapters. So I encourage you to read through both of these, both the translator editor's kind of synopsis of the chapter and then the poem itself. Um, I did this because the poem can be a challenge, and it does help to just go in with the context of what is about to happen. Uh, but challenging or not, once you kind of get into the rhythm of it, it becomes increasingly easier. And on top of that, it is simply one of the greatest texts ever written about politics, about metaphysics, about ethics, about religion, about war, and about love. So even if you kind of have to struggle through it, absolutely take the time and do it. I should also note that we do have an extremely talented philosophy professor at Queen's, Dr. Ram Murthy, and I cannot recommend him enough. His courses are fantastic. So if you ever get the chance to take one of his courses on Indian philosophy, I highly recommend that you do so. If you can't, he wrote a book entitled Indian Philosophy, an Introduction. And again, his name is Ram Murthy. And his book is absolutely a pleasure. It's one of, he really sets out very clearly, but with a lot of depth, some of the major tenets of Indian philosophy. And additionally, I would say that Dr. Murthy is one of those rare professors who lives the philosophy that he teaches. And I think that this is an important attribute when we consider the content of the Gita, because while we can academically have facts and interpretation and historical context of the text itself, it's ultimately a very different text when one attempts to embody it or to live it. So turning to the image that I have chosen for this text, we can see that the story is based on a conversation between an irresolute young prince, Arjuna. So he's the one down on his knees with the sweet mustache there. And his chariot driver, a man who is revealed to be an incarnation of the god Krishna. Now, in chapter 11 of the Gita, Krishna reveals himself to Arjuna as he truly is. And this is what the image depicts, a god or an energy force that is at the heart of all things, both beautiful and terrifying. But for the majority of the Gita, he looks like any normal chariot driver. So we're only reading the first 2 chapters of the Gita, but it is a relatively short read, and I do recommend you all take the time to read it in full. If not now, then perhaps as some reading over the summer. As the editor writes in this translation, the first chapter of the Gita is a bridge from kind of this hurly-burly of the battlefield into the realm of philosophy and mystical vision. I like this write-up on the chapter because it explains a few of the different levels of interpretation of the Gita, and this is of the utmost importance, particularly in this text, but as a philosopher in all texts. So for a long time in the academy, we have considered there to be 1 or perhaps 2 correct readings. So we can call this the classic reading of the text. So for an example, classic reading, happy, beautiful princess in a castle is kidnapped by an evil dragon and brought to his lair, then rescued by a handsome prince, and they live happily ever after, the end. So after this, we have the introduction, this kind of idea of 1, maybe 2 correct readings. We have the introduction of structuralism by a variety of thinkers, most notably Levi Strauss. And in structuralism, there's a recognition that our interpretations of stories often tell more about us and our culture than they do about the story itself. So this is what Charles Mills notes when he writes about the imaginary Orients and the imaginary Africas that really represent the heart of darkness or the desires of the colonizer more than any kind of truth about the colonized. So Derrida, a post-structuralist, introduces this idea of deconstruction. And this is a way to invert the stories that we tell. So suddenly we have, for example, a feminist reading of a text, such as Margaret Atwood's Penelopiad, where she reimagines Homer's Odyssey from the perspective of Ulysses' wife, Penelope. So to give an example, I'll do a feminist reading of that classic reading. Lonely princess, controlled by her father, enticed away by a mysterious and frightening dragon. The dragon is strange, but she grows to love him. A prince comes, kills her dragon friend, and forces her to marry him. The end. So we can see that same idea, same events, two drastically different stories. One has been the inversion of the other. And since post-structuralism and Derrida's deconstruction, there have been many, many ways of reading texts and finding truths. So one final example is that of queer theory, where power structures are not simply inverted as they are in a feminist interpretation, but are completely rearranged to give voices to those totally disenfranchised or made to be less than autonomous subjects in the classic and even in the inverted readings. So here's a queer reading of that story. Powerful, beautiful dragon flies across the sky and hears cries for help from a small, ugly, but decorated creature. She takes pity on the creature and brings it back to her home, where it eats all of her food, makes terrible squawking noises like a song, and voices an intention to stay in the dragon's cave forever, making it her own. The distraught dragon goes to seek counsel from her friends, other strong and majestic dragons, who advise her to bring the thing back to where she found it. The dragon returns home and intends to do just that, but the squawking song of the creature has attracted a potential mate, who enters the dragon's home, murders the dragon, and steals all of her treasure. Her friends gather and sing songs and tell stories to commemorate the life of the dragon before a traditional cremation of her remains. So all three of these stories have essentially the same events. And as a philosopher, we must look at the readings that we are given as a truth and then unpack its accuracy through close textual reading. Is the truth of a story or a philosophical essay or a book actually there in the text? And if not, then why do we consider that to be the truth? We must find the balance between asserting a definitive objective truth on a text or, on the other hand, kind of floundering in a sea of truths where there's this can be a truth and that can be a truth and that can be a truth. After all, not all readings check out with the text itself, and therefore not all readings are equally true. So that being said, literal interpretations of poems, especially religious poems or texts, are very common and have extreme consequences for human lives. So, for example, if we take the text of the Gita literally, it condones and even sanctifies war. If we take it as an allegory for internal struggles, then we can see how those internal struggles play out in the world. Now, these first two chapters of the Gita that we're reading for class reveal to us two wars. So there's the war without in the first chapter, and then there's the war within in the second chapter. Arjuna falls into an absolute existential crisis about the impossible position he finds himself in, as he must fight all of his cousins, mentors, uncles, and friends in order to defend his brother's rightful claim to the throne. He's absolutely paralyzed and unsure how to proceed. He knows that it is his duty to fight these men that he loves, but he also knows that it is against everything within him to kill them. He's pushed to his limits in the external world, and the only way he can consider moving forward is through moving inward. In life, we all face these moments of being absolutely crippled by the expectations of life. And it's Krishna's suggestion that we look at these moments as possibilities for spiritual growth, or that it is only through challenge and resistance that one can be propelled to change. One of the most famous lines of the Gita happens in chapter 2, verse 47, in which Krishna counsels, "You have the right to work, but never to the fruit of work. You should never engage in action for the sake of reward, nor should you long for inaction." End quote. This verse links together the war within and the war without. All we can do is our best in the world. Reality is often beyond our control. So consider the lines of the Serenity Prayer used in recovery programs. God grant me the serenity to accept the things I cannot change, the courage to change the things I can, and the wisdom to know the difference. There are always elements of reality that we cannot control, and as such, attaching our worth and meaning to the destination rather than the journey will always leave us disappointed. For example, I'm right now finishing my PhD dissertation, applying for postdoctoral positions at various universities. So the job market right now is fairly competitive. And if I attach my worth to the job I get after this year, it's kind of the fruit of all of this action, I may find myself as nothing. But if I attach my worth to the process of these past 5 years of getting to research and write philosophy, traveling to different universities to study with experts on Simone Weil, learning to teach and engaging with students, sharing ideas, arguing with fellow graduate students over a coffee or a glass of wine, presenting at conferences, all of these things are the rich and varied actions that I've been so fortunate to take. And to those, I have an absolute claim. And those are far richer than the final destination or the fruit of those actions. In this case, a job. Now, don't get me wrong, I want a job. But that is not the reason I do what I do. And the Gita is reminding me of this. Because we live in a consumer capitalist society, this can be difficult to conceptualize at times. Indeed, we often want the fruit without even having to go through the performance of the actions. This verse tells us that we must act in the world, or to follow the analogy of the text, we must fight in the war of our lives for the good of others and ourselves. And we must recognize that these actions are informed by and inform our internal struggle or the war within. So our actions may turn out as we want, or perhaps they will not, but we must act regardless. This reminds me of another quote from Mother Teresa, which she adapted from Kent Keith's Paradoxical Commandments. In this famous quote goes, "People are often unreasonable, irrational, and self-centered. Forgive them anyway. If you are kind, people may accuse you of selfish, ulterior motives. Be kind anyway. If you are successful, you will win some unfaithful friends and some genuine enemies. Succeed anyway. If you are honest and sincere, people may deceive you. Be honest and sincere anyway. What you spend years creating, others could destroy overnight. Create anyway. If you find serenity and happiness, some may be jealous. Be happy anyway. The good you do today will often be forgotten. Do good anyway. Give the best you have, and it will never be enough. Give your best anyway. In the final analysis, it is between you and God. It was never between you and them anyway." And I think this is very much to the spirit of the Gita, is this detachment or this shift in our focus from the fruits to the action. And I've given two quotes on the slide here. The first is The War Without, wherein, quote, overwhelmed by sorrow, Arjuna spoke these words, and casting away his bow and his arrows, he sat down in his chariot in the middle of the battlefield. So here we have this external existential crisis, this uncertainty of what to do, how to act in the external world. This turns into the path going inwards, the war within. Second quote, they live in wisdom who see themselves in all and all in them, who have renounced every selfish desire and sense craving tormenting the heart. And this quote is referred to by Gandhi as the heart of the Gita. That if the rest of the Gita was lost, this quote alone, this verse alone, is enough to base your life on. Here we have a very famous photograph from Time magazine by Marc Ribot. And this is the woman here holding the flowers. Her name is Jan Rose Cashmere. And in it, she confronts the National Guard outside of the Pentagon in 1967 during an anti-Vietnam War march. So this text, the Bhagavad Gita, is political to its very core because it suggests the possibility of a literal war without and an allegorical war within. Only by balancing the war within can one peacefully and non-violently resist and make change. From a Western position, even despite our increased levels of self-care and reflection on mental health, we have the instinct to consider turning inward as anti-political, self-absorbed, narcissistic, egotistical, navel-gazing, etc., etc., etc. But instead, consider the oxygen mask analogy, or the idea that we cannot help others until we help ourselves. Consider the suggestion that it is only in finding inner balance that we can understand what is ethically correct action and end our cycle of needlessly harming others. If these elements are so closely interrelated, then a keystone part of thriving political agendas is a meditative inward turning or spiritual practice. Again, this is quite foreign to common Western distinctions that separate church and state, or suggest that the political can exist on its own without the spiritual. But for the Gita and the thinkers who refer to it in their own political thought, this division is simply impossible. For Gandhi, ethical political life required meditation. For the Reverend Dr. Martin Luther King Jr., it required a Christianity focused on Jesus and the biblical theme of love. For Thoreau, it's an emphasis on the marvel and beauty of nature and the human potential to commune with that nature in silence and introspection. So all three of these thinkers are then led to peaceful resistance to oppression that is in no way passive, but makes an enormous, that takes an enormous amount of strength, will, and self-assuredness that can only be fueled by their rich spiritual sensibilities. And I do want to emphasize, spiritual sensibilities do not necessarily mean a belief in God. For Thoreau, his spirituality comes from nature. So there are a variety of ways in which this spirituality can manifest. So with that, we're going to conclude this class on the Bhagavad Gita. I encourage you to go as deep as you can, or you have time to, with the reading of this truly incredible text. And I will see you all next lecture as we jump into Henry David Thoreau.